My fiancée kept bringing up that I wasn't invited to her family gathering. Her friend mocked me, saying, "We simply won't let you in." I disappeared from their lives forever. Her colleague spotted my photo on a business magazine. A week later, their messages remained ignored. My name is Nathan Brooks, and I'm 29 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened just a few months ago, but it feels like a lifetime. It was one of those moments that completely changes how you see yourself and the people around you. I had just turned the key in my apartment lock after what felt like the longest day of my life. 12 brutal hours of spreadsheets and strategy sessions at work, forcing strained smiles all day long while every muscle in my body ached for the comfort of home. I was exhausted to my bones, with that familiar office stench still clinging to my clothes like a reminder of the corporate grind. When I stepped inside, I expected to find our usual quiet, empty apartment. Instead, I found Victoria standing in the foyer, under the soft glow of our chandelier. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and her lips were painted that perfect holiday red she always wore to special occasions. She looked like a vision straight from a festive gala, too beautiful, too composed for the news I was about to receive. I could tell something was wrong immediately. She was biting her lower lip, that familiar nervous tic she'd inherited from her mother. Her eyes darted away from mine just long enough for me to catch a flicker of dread in them. The air between us felt heavy with unspoken words. "Please don't come to my parents' New Year's Eve party," she whispered, her voice so low it was like she was afraid to wake the ghosts of holidays past. I froze completely, stunned by her words. My briefcase fell from my hand, the papers inside rustling in protest against the hardwood floor. For a moment, I couldn't process what she'd just said. This was the same party I'd been attending for years, the same celebration I'd already mentally prepared for. "What are you talking about?" I managed to force some calmness into my tone, though my heart was thundering against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. Victoria's cheeks burned red beneath her carefully applied makeup, like she'd been caught in some terrible lie. She looked at me with such anguish that it made my chest tighten painfully. When I pressed her for an explanation, asking why I was suddenly unwelcome, she simply shook her head. Her hair brushed against her cheek as she moved, and those green eyes that were usually so warm and inviting were now clouded with something unfamiliar. Shame, perhaps, or fear. "It's complicated," she replied, which wasn't really an answer at all. Before I could speak again, before I could demand a real explanation, her sister Christina's face appeared on Victoria's phone screen. The phone was perched on speaker at Victoria's elbow, and Christina's voice came through crisp and clinical, like she was delivering a business report rather than destroying someone's holiday plans. "We'll just say we don't know him if he shows up," Christina said matter-of-factly. I felt my throat close up as those words echoed off our walls. "Don't come. We don't know him." Just like that, my invitation was revoked. No explanation, no room for argument, no consideration for how this might make me feel. I looked at my wife, the woman I loved and trusted with every secret I'd ever had, and saw her caught between loyalty to her family and fear of my disappointment. It was like I'd somehow conspired against her to create this impossible ultimatum. My mind raced back to all those New Year's celebrations I'd spent under her parents' ornate roof. The sumptuous feasts we'd shared, the laughter that had once felt so genuine and warm. I remembered the way her father Richard used to toast our happiness like it was some precious gift he'd bestowed upon us. Until now. Now those memories felt completely hollow, like elaborate performances I'd been too naive to recognize. I stood there in our foyer, saying nothing. I didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't try to change their minds. The truth was, I would have done almost anything for Victoria. But to argue now would have placed her in an impossible position, caught between me and the people she'd known her entire life. So I swallowed hard, tasting the salt of unshed tears, and felt my hand drift almost unconsciously to my phone. The digital invitation to the Whitmore family New Year's party was still glowing on my screen, mocking me with its festive graphics and cheerful fonts. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, watching the cursor hover over the accept and decline buttons. For just a heartbeat, I let my cursor linger over accept, as if clicking it might somehow undo this entire conversation. Then, with a finality that surprised even me, I clicked decline. The RSVP disappeared as silently as my hopes of ever truly belonging to this family. Victoria glanced toward our front door like she was expecting her family to suddenly materialize in the hallway with their disappointed expressions and icy greetings. The guilt was written all over her face, and when she finally spoke, her voice was breaking. "I'm sorry," she murmured, stepping forward and placing a trembling hand on my arm. I recoiled instinctively, like her touch actually burned. I couldn't help it. In that moment, I needed to study her face, searching desperately for the woman I'd married. The one who used to laugh at my jokes, who encouraged my dreams of writing a book, who met me halfway through every storm we'd weathered together. But tonight, she felt like a stranger. Her sorrow, genuine as it might have been, felt like a betrayal I couldn't quite wrap my head around. I found I couldn't comfort her without betraying myself, so I simply sat down heavily on the edge of our sofa. Those festive red velvet cushions that had once represented warmth and holiday cheer now felt like a cruel mockery. The glow from the string lights we draped across the mantel cast shadows that danced mournfully across the hardwood floor, like even our decorations were mourning what we'd lost. I nodded once, sharply, like I was closing a door on something I could no longer salvage. Victoria watched me with wide, frightened eyes, like she expected me to explode in anger or dissolve into tears. But honestly, all I felt was an emptiness so profound it threatened to swallow me whole. I reached for the remote and switched on the television, muting the sound so that flickering images of holiday commercials and carolers provided a surreal backdrop to our unraveling. Victoria's foot tapped nervously against the hardwood floor, creating a rhythm that matched the shudder in her voice when she whispered, "I love you." Those words just hung there in the air between us like some fragile offering I didn't know how to receive. I sat rigidly, unable to move, unable to speak. The seconds stretched into minutes, heavy with unspoken apologies and unmet expectations that lay between us like vast, unbridgeable chasms. When I finally looked at her again, I saw tears pooling at the corners of her eyes. My own vision blurred in response, and I had to force myself to swallow the lump that had formed in my throat. But I stayed silent, because in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. I had been waiting my whole life for permission to belong, for someone to recognize me and invite me into a circle where my presence actually mattered. And here, in the place I called home, I was being explicitly told that I didn't belong at all. Victoria wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater and took a step back from me, like she was afraid to touch me again. Her red lipstick was smudged slightly at the corner of her mouth, a vivid testament to the emotional begging she'd carried without words. The distance between us felt insurmountable. "I'll call you in a bit," she said haltingly, her voice barely above a whisper. As she closed the door behind her, the click of the latch sounded less like an ending and more like an echo of a lifetime of doors closing in my face. I remained seated on that sofa long after her footsteps had faded down the hallway, staring at the muted television as my invitation to my own life had been quietly revoked. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply sat there and watched the television continue its endless loop of holiday cheer, feeling the last threads of my old self untangle and fall away like worn fabric. That night, I realized it would be the last New Year's Eve I would ever spend waiting for someone else's permission to belong. In the hollow quiet that followed Victoria's departure, something new began to form inside me. It was an awakening that would eventually lead me far beyond the red lipstick gatekeepers of family dinners and forced toasts, toward a place entirely of my own making. What they didn't know, what I hadn't told them, was that I had just signed a publishing deal with a global marketing firm. It was an agreement that would place my research and analysis before millions of readers across continents. I had spent the past 4 years buried deep in obscure data sets, refining complex models that could predict consumer behavior trends with startling accuracy. For months, I'd been quietly submitting op-eds to prestigious business journals, building a reputation they knew nothing about. None of this mattered to Victoria's family, of course. They saw me only as the quiet husband who didn't come from money, the one whose day job involved numbers and theories instead of boardrooms and bank accounts. They had no idea that in just 5 days, I would be featured on the cover of a major magazine, framed against the skyline of the city that never sleeps. The photograph would show me with laughter in my eyes and confidence in my stance, marking the culmination of endless flights, late-night calls with editors in Frankfurt and Tokyo, and a sleepless January spent polishing a manuscript that had begun as a whispered idea and grown into a global proposal. No one had asked about my work. Not Victoria's mother with her perfect coiffure and matching pearls, who tracked weddings and designer dress appointments like they were stock market indices. Not her father, whose approval had always felt as unattainable as the presidency he secretly coveted for his daughter. They had always tolerated me at best, treating me like some novelty, Victoria's quirky husband they could showcase like a rare vintage car. Interesting, uncommon, but ultimately peripheral to the family's main attraction. So I kept those recent triumphs to myself, tucked away like secret gifts waiting to be unwrapped. In the days after I declined the New Year's invitation, I spent my evenings drafting the foreword to my forthcoming book. While their invitation had promised holiday warmth and family cheer, my pen scratched out truths I would rather share with strangers in hushed auditoriums than with relatives who had once referred to me as an aesthetic liability. I wrote about reinvention, about the power of silence, and about the confidence that blooms when you realize you no longer need anyone's permission to exist. The words flowed easily, fueled by the sting of exclusion and the exhilaration of achievement that nobody around me could see coming. Late one night while the city slept around me, I received an email from the magazine's editor that would change everything. The subject line was simple, but the words inside made my breath catch in my chest. Cover story finalized. You're on the January issue. Congratulations. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, imagining those glossy pages where my face would greet readers, where my voice would finally be heard by people who mattered. A smile bloomed on my lips, though it was tempered by the memory of Victoria's trembling apology and Christina's cold threat echoing in my mind. They had erased me from their holiday plans like I was some inconvenient footnote, but soon the world would be featuring me, whether they liked it or not. I didn't broadcast this news on social media. I didn't post any celebratory status updates or share links with acquaintances who might congratulate me. Instead, I printed out a single hard copy of the editor's email and slid it carefully into the front pocket of my leather satchel. I carried it with me everywhere after that. To the coffee shop where I revised Chapter 3 of my book, to the park bench where I mentored an aspiring entrepreneur, even to the supply closet at work where I sometimes hid for 5 minutes just so I could breathe without interruptions. That email felt like a talisman, a tangible reminder that when one door closes, another opens. But this wasn't just any door. This was a door I had built myself, brick by brick, word by word, through years of dedication they had never bothered to notice. 5 days before the publication date, I woke up early and walked to the bookstore downtown. The streets were quiet, decorated with strings of lights and red bows that should have filled me with holiday spirit. But the sparkle felt hollow without someone genuine to share it with. I carried my satchel across my shoulder like a shield, imagining the weight of future hardcover editions inside, each one bearing my name alongside the tagline, consulting expert turned author. My chest swelled with pride and vindication, but also with a sudden, powerful realization. None of this would matter unless I claimed it entirely for myself. I couldn't let their validation or lack thereof define the significance of my achievement. I pushed open the door of the bookstore, hearing the familiar bell chime softly overhead. The warmth inside wrapped around me like a blanket, scented with new paper and polished wood. I wandered the aisles until I found the marketing section, my domain. The shelves were filled with titles about consumer psychology, brand strategy, and market analysis. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, imagining one day seeing my own book nestled here among the others, spine straight and title gleaming under the fluorescent lights. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app, pointing it at the empty shelf where I knew I would belong someday. My heart raced as I pressed the shutter button. This moment felt like the calm before the storm of recognition that was coming, and I wanted to capture it while it was still mine alone. On my way home, I slipped past the newsstand and paused when I saw them. The January issues had already arrived. The covers were stacked neatly beside magazines boasting holiday recipes and best-selling novels. I hesitated for just a moment, then approached and lifted the top copy with trembling hands. There I was, Nathan Brooks, 29 years old, standing with perfect posture against the city skyline that framed me like an emblem of modern ambition. Below my photograph, a bold headline read, Nathan Brooks, predicting consumer trends in an unpredictable world. The smaller subheading promised insights into my unique approach to market forecasting, the very expertise that Victoria's family had dismissed as boring number crunching. I flipped through the pages, tracing the article with my finger like I was committing every word to memory. The text described my years of research, my unconventional methods, and the data-driven passion that had propelled me from a small apartment office to global recognition. Reading my own words in print felt surreal, like discovering a part of myself I'd never known existed. A group of commuters clustered near the newsstand, picking up copies for their morning train rides. I stepped aside, breathing steadily as I watched them pay and move on. One woman tucked the magazine under her arm before boarding the bus. Another handed it to a young man who smiled as he scanned the cover. They didn't know me personally, but they had chosen my story over holiday gift guides and celebrity gossip. My silent achievement had finally begun to speak for itself. That evening, my phone started buzzing with a string of incoming messages that I had been both dreading and anticipating. The first notification was from Victoria. Nathan, are you okay? I saw something online. Are you in the magazine? Then came Christina's message. I apologize, I just saw the cover. Finally, Richard himself. We need to talk. Call me. I stared at this parade of notifications lighting up my screen, feeling a hollow sort of triumph wash over me. They were calling now, but not because they suddenly cared about me as a person. They were calling because they were embarrassed, because they had finally seen me in a context that mattered to them. Public recognition that reflected well on their family name. I made a conscious decision in that moment. I did not reply to any of their messages. I did not return their calls. I didn't give them the satisfaction of hearing the desperation or vindication in my voice. Instead, I sat calmly at my desk, opened a blank document on my computer, and began drafting Chapter 3 of my book. I wrote about transformation, about how a man who had spent years waiting for permission to belong could become the author of his own destiny. I described the unique warmth that comes from earned recognition, the kind found not in forced invitations or guilty apologies, but in genuine accolades from people who valued your work. As the words flowed onto the page, I realized that the family portrait I had once desperately sought to inhabit had shifted permanently. Now it would have to include me whether they acknowledged it or not. In the quiet hum of my apartment, I began to understand that the achievements I had once hidden away like shameful secrets would become the cornerstones of my new narrative. I would no longer exist as a mere accessory in someone else's story, tolerated but uncelebrated, present but peripheral. I would be the protagonist of a tale I was writing entirely myself. I would no longer ask for permission to attend their party. Instead, I would host my own. And so I continued writing, filling page after page with the conviction that silence could be more powerful than any argument. That absence could speak louder than presence. All the things I hadn't said to Victoria's family, the publishing deal, the magazine feature, the impending book launch, found their voice here on these pages. In this narrative I was creating, they would come to know me not because they had graciously invited me into their circle, but because I had chosen to let the world see me for who I truly was. By the time my fingers finally stilled and the final sentence of Chapter 3 awaited its completion, I felt the weight of all those unspoken truths lift from my shoulders like a physical burden I'd been carrying for years. I closed my laptop and looked at the framed photograph of my parents on my desk, allowing myself a gentle, genuine smile. Tomorrow I would walk into the world with the absolute certainty that I belonged, not because anyone had given me permission, but because I had claimed my place through my own accomplishments. And that knowledge, more than any invitation or belated apology, would guide me forward into whatever came next. I spent the rest of the evening watching the party unfold from the quiet sanctuary of my study, the glow of my laptop casting my reflection onto the screen like a phantom image I scarcely recognized. Through Victoria's social media feed, I could see the lavish display of New Year's lights twinkling like captive stars along the grand veranda of Richard Whitmore's estate. The camera panned over clusters of guests in fur-trimmed coats and sequined dresses, their laughter drifting through the digital unreality like distant church bells on New Year's Eve. My own presence was conspicuously absent from every frame, a blank space where I should have been standing, adjusting Victoria's wrap or steadying her with a whispered compliment. Instead, I was here alone, my heart both aching and delighted with the satisfaction of knowing they had to look for me in those photos and not find me anywhere. A photograph surfaced in my feed showing Victoria looking absolutely resplendent in emerald velvet, leaning into Christina, whose crystal earrings caught the reflection of the roadway lights like tiny prisms. Their father, Richard, stood behind them in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his eyebrows raised just enough to suggest he believed he'd won some unspoken battle between us. In the caption, Christina had cheered, "Family, wine, laughter, New Year's perfection, hash Whitmore holiday, hash love and light." The photo racked up hundreds of likes within minutes. Friends of friends, college classmates, business associates. The comments tumbled in, praising the glamorous celebration, tagging acquaintances who might have overlooked their own invitations. Not one of them realized that the most important member of this family celebration had been deliberately uninvited. For a moment, I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes, and I could almost hear the delicate tinkle of champagne glasses as servers glided by on silver trays. I could imagine the hum of polite conversation swirling around the towering New Year's tree in their foyer, its ornaments forged from heirloom crystal that caught the light and refracted it luxuriously across the marble floors. I pictured the hush that would have fallen once the Whitmore family patriarch rose to make his traditional toast, those carefully chosen words of gratitude and hope, punctuated by the gentle clinking of crystal flutes. The applause would have been warm, a gesture of communal pride and shared celebration. But in that moment, I realized that applause would have been for strangers, for a version of me they had pretended never existed. A second carousel of images appeared, this time on Instagram stories. There was a close-up of Christina's hand entwined with Victoria's, her manicured nails polished to a glossy sheen that reflected the party lights. The next slide showed wine swirling in crystal goblets, the deep ruby red seeming to pulse with merriment. Then came a boomerang of Richard raising his glass, his booming toast echoing as he clicked the side of his flute against the camera lens. The final slide paused on Victoria, turned toward the camera with her lips curved into that practiced half-smile she wore when she felt caught between loyalty and love. Beneath her photo, someone had scrolled a comment. "Wish Nathan could be here. Hash missing. Someone." Her sister quickly replied with a shrug emoji. I suppose it felt easier to joke about my absence than to admit the discomfort they had created by excluding me in the first place. I didn't scowl or punch my fist into the desk. Instead, I felt that quiet satisfaction bloom beneath my ribs, the kind that comes from knowing you are seen, even if only in your absence. 5 days had passed since I'd watched that golden envelope slip through my door, the last desperate invitation that I had left deliberately unread. 5 days without their orchestrated warmth and perfunctory smiles. 5 days in which I had leaned fully into my own life, mentoring budding entrepreneurs, drafting chapters of my book, and savoring the private joy of being unseen by those who had never truly wanted to see me. Then, just as I was about to close my browser and return to my work, I felt my phone buzz with an alert from Donna, one of Victoria's college friends who had never actually met me, but had exchanged surface-level pleasantries with me at every holiday gathering for years. "Wait, is this you on the Business Weekly cover?" Her message read, followed by a screenshot of an online article headlined, "Nathan Brooks, the quiet consultant who became global thought leader." In the photograph, I was wearing a tailored navy suit against an urban skyline, my expression calm and assured. The piece described my impending book release, detailed my journey from underdog to strategist, and noted the groundbreaking economic model I would be unveiling at next month's international symposium. For a heartbeat, I sat completely motionless, my phone trembling in my hand. Then I smiled wide and unself-consciously, like relief had finally poured through my veins after years of being held back. Yes, that was me. The man they had refused to acknowledge at their New Year's party was now commanding global attention for his expertise. The same hands that had typed countless reports in sterile conference rooms were now being applauded in digital auditoriums around the world. I wanted to forward Donna's message to Victoria, to Christina, to Richard, to every single person who had thought me inconsequential. But instead, I tucked my phone back into my pocket and closed my laptop quietly, choosing to spend the rest of the morning at my favorite cafe, sipping black coffee as I read the Business Weekly profile on my phone. The barista wished me a happy Monday when I walked into the cafe, calling out my name with a familiarity that made my face soften. I nodded and returned her smile, marveling at the ease with which she pronounced my last name. Brooks, like we were old friends who had known each other for years. She handed me my steaming pour-over and set it down with genuine warmth. "Good luck with everything today," she said, implying that she somehow understood the weight of my day without needing me to spell it out for her. I found my usual window seat and thumbed through the article on my phone, paragraph after paragraph, celebrating what they called the elegant simplicity of my marketing forecasts. The piece detailed how I used unexpected data points, things like coffee sales patterns or commute times, to anticipate major market shifts with startling accuracy. There was even a quote from me about the significance of failure that I had written during a particularly late night of solitude. "No risk is real unless you learn from its aftermath." I had written those words uncertain whether anyone would ever care about my perspective, and now they were printed in glossy ink, bearing my digital signature for the entire business world to see. A man at the next table glanced over at my phone screen and nodded appreciatively, mouthing, "Congratulations," when he caught my eye. I felt a surge of gratitude for these strangers whose respect was offered so freely, without subtext or hidden agendas or conditions. It was just recognition, pure and simple. I lifted my mug in thanks and took a slow sip, relishing the honest bitterness of the coffee. It felt like the perfect metaphor for this moment, something real and uncompromising, without any artificial sweetness to mask its true nature. When I returned home that afternoon, I found another string of messages waiting for me from Victoria's family group chat. This time, the tone was markedly different from their previous silence. "Nathan, we're so proud," Christina had written, as if she hadn't been the one to coldly declare they would pretend not to know me if I showed up to their party. Richard's message was equally tone-deaf. "Next event you speak at, I expect a personal invitation." Victoria's text was the last one, and it cut deeper than the others. "I'm sorry, I was wrong. Please forgive me." She had included a photograph of herself with red-rimmed eyes, tears streaking down her cheeks as winter lights reflected in the moisture like tiny stars. I stared at these messages without replying, thinking about every unanswered invitation I had received over the years, every corrected RSVP, every exchange of hollow pleasantries at their annual gatherings. I thought about the loneliness I had felt while waiting for their permission to belong, permission they had never intended to give me in the first place. I thought about Donna's simple question, "Is this you on the Business Weekly cover?" And how it had completely shattered the illusion that Victoria's family were the gatekeepers of my worth. I slipped my phone into my pocket and walked through my apartment, pausing in front of the mantel where two small candles burned steadily. Their flames danced in the reflection of the frozen world beyond my window, where streetlights were blurred by drifting snow. Behind me, the invitation from Victoria's family still sat atop my piano, unclaimed and gathering dust. Its gold-trimmed edge stood out starkly against the simplicity of the room. I imagined how it would feel to keep it there permanently, a relic of my old life, an artifact from the days when I waited for someone else's nod of acceptance before I dared to let myself shine. In the hush that followed this realization, I reached out and extinguished one candle, then the other, letting the room slip into gentle darkness. Outside, the city lights continued to twinkle, completely unconcerned with my absence or presence. In that quiet void, I felt a freedom I had never known before. The freedom born from realizing that I no longer needed to be part of their story. The world was reading me back into existence, one magazine cover at a time. No amount of red lipstick ultimatums or family manipulation could erase the man I had become through my own determination and talent. 5 days after my face first graced the cover of Business Weekly, my phone began to buzz with a series of missed calls that felt like an assault on my newfound peace. Each one lit up the screen with a name that had once held unquestioned authority over my emotional life. First came Victoria's frantic number with text previews flashing on my lock screen. "Nathan, please call me now." I stared at the notification for a long moment, feeling neither anger nor relief, but a quiet curiosity about what she could possibly say now that I had proven myself completely independent of her family's approval. I let the call go to voicemail. Next was Christina, her name accompanied by the familiar sphere of her sister's wedding ring sparkling against the glass background of her contact photo. Then came Richard. Yes, him too. His digits glaring at me like an indictment I had no intention of answering. Each call felt like a summons to a stage where they expected me to perform contrition, to fall back into my old role of grateful outsider. But I wasn't performing anymore. I was simply living my life on my own terms. I waited until early evening, when the sky had bled into deep indigo and the city lights shimmered like fireflies on the horizon. Only then did I return Victoria's call, my heart thudding in my chest for reasons I couldn't quite name. Was it anticipation? Nostalgia? Perhaps it was the last ember of hope that something in our shared history could still matter. When she answered, her voice cracked like ice under pressure. "Nathan," she began, like my name itself was a plea for forgiveness. "I saw the magazine. Why didn't you tell me?" Her question landed softly between us, weighted with expectation and hurt. I closed my eyes and pictured her in our living room, probably curled up on the ottoman couch with her knees beneath her, hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate with marshmallows. The way she always drank it when she was upset. I remembered the nights when she used to listen to my early chapter drafts, praising my sentences like they were small revelations. But that was before the party, before the ultimatum. Before I realized I could redefine my own worth without anyone's permission. "I didn't tell you," I said slowly, letting each word carry its full weight, because it wasn't my story to share with a family that had already decided I wasn't worth celebrating. The words felt sharper than I had intended, but they rang absolutely true. I heard her inhale sharply, a tremor passing through the phone line like a small earthquake. "Nathan, we could have celebrated together," she whispered, her voice tight with regret. "I would have put my hands on your shoulders and told them all how proud I am of you." Pride. There it was, that sentiment so easily spoken, yet so difficult to act upon when circumstances demanded choosing between me and her family's expectations. I allowed a long silence to stretch between us, letting unspoken memories flood both our minds. I thought about our first New Year's Eve together, when she had helped me stuff stockings into the fireplace mantel. I remembered the midwinter storms we had weathered hand in hand, the promises we had carved beneath the twinkling lights of our first Christmas tree together. Then I spoke again, my voice steady and clear. "They weren't calling me because they cared, Victoria. They're calling me because they're embarrassed." Her sob came suddenly and raw, cracking through the phone line like a physical blow. I sucked in a quick breath, my own pulse rattling in response. Empathy isn't something you get over easily, even when you've resolved not to return to old patterns of accommodation. "I'm sorry," she cried, her voice breaking completely. "For everything." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. Somehow the motion made me feel steadier, more grounded in my decision. "You don't have to be sorry for who you are," I said gently. "But you have to learn to be sorry for what they did and what you allowed them to do." Our conversation drifted into halting admissions and confessions of hurt and longing. Victoria's words tumbled out in a rush, regrets over dinners that had been canceled, texts that went unanswered, invitations that were declined without explanation. I listened, recognizing that she too had been caught between her rightful desire to defend me and her deep-seated fear of defying her family's expectations. I knew that conflict all too well. I remembered countless nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering if anyone would ever choose me over their own comfort and conformity. Now that question finally had an answer I could believe in. After we had spoken for what felt like hours, sharing painful truths we'd both been avoiding, I told her gently that I needed time. Not to nurse my resentment or plan some elaborate revenge, but to forge a new path forward without the crushing weight of their old expectations. "I'm building something here, Victoria," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Something more than just seeking approval from people who don't see my value. Something that belongs only to me." I could hear her nodding on the other end of the line, even through the crackle and static of our connection. "Build," she replied simply, "and let me help." I promised to meet her the next morning for coffee, neutral ground, where we might decide whether we could reconstruct our shared narrative or if we'd grown too far apart to bridge the gap. But when I hung up the phone, I felt that familiar pulse of freedom coursing through me. Their calls had come like sirens, summoning me back into a sea of obligation and conditional love. Yet I had answered only on my own terms, and only when I chose to. That small act of self-determination felt like a victory in itself. Later that night, I sat in my study with papers spread across my desk, my mind already turning toward the morning ahead. I thought about the countless late nights I had spent perfecting my marketing models, the moments of crushing doubt before I pitched my manuscript to publishers, the pure exhilaration when the editor finally called to say yes. These fragments of memory formed a mosaic of achievement that felt far more solid and real than any holiday invitation ever could. I realized that their apologies, their embarrassment, even their desperate hope to somehow reclaim me as part of their story. These were all just signatures on a contract I no longer needed to sign. When dawn finally broke, I dressed carefully in a crisp white shirt and blazer. Not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I had learned that confidence often begins with the smallest details, with taking care of yourself in ways that feel authentic and purposeful. I left a simple note on the kitchen counter for Victoria. Coffee next to the map pin of our favorite cafe. Then I walked out the door with a calmness I had never known before, the kind that comes from finally understanding your own worth. At the cafe, I found Victoria already waiting for me. Her cheeks were flushed with the cold morning air, and her eyes were still ringed with the remnants of last night's tears. She stood as I approached, and for an instant, I saw her not as the daughter torn between two impossible worlds, but as the woman who had once believed in me without any reservations. "Good morning," she said softly, sliding into the seat opposite me. I nodded in greeting. For a moment, our hands hovered above the table, uncertain whether they belonged to strangers or to partners who had somehow lost their way. I let the silence settle around us like a soft blanket before reaching across to take her hand gently in mine. "Morning," I replied, my voice steady and sure. "I'm glad you called me." She exhaled deeply, relief breaking through her expression like sunlight through clouds. "I am too." We talked then, not about parties or apologies or the painful dynamics of her family, but about our dreams. I told her about my next speaking engagement, a major conference in Frankfurt, where I would be unveiling my marketing forecasting model to an international audience. She shared her own ambitions, her carefully laid plans to launch her own design studio in the spring. Slowly, carefully, we began to sketch out a future that could include each other, not as appendages to someone else's family brand, but as true partners in a shared journey of growth and discovery. When we finally stood to leave the cafe, the tension that had existed between us for months had eased considerably, replaced by something that felt like a quiet partnership. It was a bond forged in the fire of exclusion and tempered by our newfound mutual respect for each other's individual journeys. Outside, the winter sun shone brightly, like it was welcoming our renewed resolve. As we walked side by side down the sidewalk, our breaths visible in the crisp air, I realized that the buzz of those missed calls the night before had led me not back to where I once was, but forward to a place where I would answer only to myself and to the people who had always truly seen me for who I was. A week after the holiday party that had never welcomed me, another envelope arrived at my door. This one was hand-addressed in the looping script I recognized immediately as Victoria's mother's handwriting, elegant and precise, written on cream-colored cardstock edged in gold foil. The envelope crackled when I peeled it open, and inside lay a card proclaiming in ornate lettering, "You are cordially invited to New Year's Day brunch at the Whitmore estate." My fingers trembled as I held the invitation, feeling that familiar pang of longing twist inside my chest. I stared at the words like they had been written in a language I no longer understood. Brunch, family, New Year, welcome. None of these concepts sounded like home to me anymore. I carried that envelope with me for days, slipping it into the front pocket of my messenger bag and pulling it out at odd moments. I found myself reading it over coffee in the morning, between paragraphs of Chapter 4, even in the middle of mentoring sessions with young entrepreneurs. Each time I looked at those formal words, I felt my old self flare to life, the version of me that had spent years desperately seeking acceptance from Victoria's family, who had learned all their patterns of politeness, who had swallowed enough snide remarks to sink a ship. That old self wanted desperately to respond, to accept their invitation, to forgive and forget, to prove once more that he could somehow fit into their carefully curated world. But this time, something deeper guided my decision, a quiet conviction that had been growing stronger with each passing day. I left the invitation on my desk for 3 full days, face up like a challenge I was still deciding whether to accept. On the fourth morning, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Blake, Victoria's cousin, standing there in his wool coat and gloves, holding a sealed, identical envelope. His breath was clouded in the cold air as he cleared his throat formally. "Nathan," he said, his voice carrying that same stiff politeness I remembered from family gatherings. "My aunt asked me to deliver this personally." He extended the envelope toward me, our fingers brushing briefly in a fleeting echo of the time when our families had mingled together without tension or awkwardness. I accepted it with a quiet thank you and watched him turn away, uncertain whether he should stay and make small talk or simply complete his mission and leave. Inside, the second invitation was absolutely identical. Same gold trim, same embossed lettering, same formal language that felt increasingly foreign to me. For a moment, I found myself wondering if any of them truly believed I would change my mind, if they just delivered it in person, if they thought their persistence alone would somehow erode my resolve and bring me back into the fold. I set the card on my coffee table next to the first one and ran my hand through my hair, marveling at how utterly foreign this whole situation felt. Years ago, I would have leaped at any chance to reconcile with them. I would have arrived at their brunch with a bottle of expensive champagne and a gift basket of holiday treats, ready to smile through half-hearted pleasantries and pretend that nothing had ever gone wrong between us. Now, all I felt was an irreducible distance between their world and mine, a gap that couldn't be bridged by fancy invitations or guilt-driven gestures. That afternoon, I drafted an email response. "Thank you for the invitation. Regrettably, I will be unable to attend." I paused with my fingers hovering above the keyboard, then deleted the entire message. The curt, formal phrasing felt like an apology I didn't owe them. Instead, I wrote 2 simple sentences. "Thank you for thinking of me. I won't be joining you this year." It felt honest and direct, neither dismissive nor inviting further conversation. I saved the draft and closed my laptop without sending it, still not quite ready to make my decision final. Over the next 2 days, the invitations continued to multiply, like some desperate campaign to wear down my resistance. The third one landed in my mailbox, this time accompanied by a small sprig of holly tied with a red ribbon. The card inside omitted the formal wording entirely, instead featuring a handwritten note. "Please come. We miss you, Nathan. Love, Victoria." Underneath was Christina's chicken scratch signature, barely legible but unmistakably hers. A week earlier, such a message might have brought me to tears, might have shattered my resolve completely. But now it felt like an afterthought, a perfunctory gesture that couldn't undo months of feeling invisible and unwanted. I no longer craved their company or their approval. I touched the holly's glossy leaves between my fingers and felt my old longing dissolve entirely, replaced by a calm certainty that I belonged somewhere else entirely. On the morning of New Year's Day, I woke to gray skies and the gentle hush of snow falling outside my window. I dressed deliberately in a charcoal sweater and comfortable jeans, my intent focused on having a quiet day of writing and reflection rather than performative socializing. Before I left my apartment for the day, I retrieved the first invitation from my desk, along with the second and third ones that had accumulated over the week. I laid them side by side on my dining table, their gold trims gleaming softly in the early morning light like they were mocking one another for their futile insistence on my attention. I imagined the scene that was probably unfolding at that very moment inside the Whitmore estate. The hushed elegance as guests gathered in their finest brunch attire, the gentle clinking of silver coffee pots against delicate china, the rustle of silk napkins being placed across laps, the murmur of carefully modulated small talk exchanged over delicate pastries and fresh fruit arrangements. Part of me recoiled from that scene, preserved in amber by polite smiles and enforced harmony. It felt like a performance I no longer had any interest in joining. I poured myself a cup of strong black coffee and carried it back to the table, studying those envelopes like they were relics from an old life I was finally ready to leave behind. In them, I could see all the patterns of my own self-doubt. The years I had spent contorting myself to fit their expectations, trying to be the perfect husband and polite consultant, content to exist as a silent ornament in their elaborate family display. I could see the echo of my mother's voice from childhood, constantly urging me to adapt and conform, to seek approval at any cost, never to rock the boat or make waves. But I could also see something entirely new. The emergence of a man who no longer sought validation from people who had actively denied him entry into his own life. The decision crystallized in my mind with startling clarity. I left my coffee unfinished on the table, reached for all three invitations, and in one swift motion, I ripped open the envelopes and pulled out the cards. I paused for just a moment, reading the formal words one final time, then crumpled the papers in my fist. The sound of it, muted beneath my grip, felt like a release I had been waiting for my entire adult life. I gathered up the torn envelopes and crumpled notes and dropped them all into my wastebasket. The varied paint inside the can became flecked with glittering scraps of gold foil, the remains of invitations I had never truly intended to accept. I pressed down on the handle, flattening the fragments into indiscernible confetti, the final remnants of a version of myself that no longer existed. Later that afternoon, standing at my desk with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years, I picked up a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. Not an apology, not an explanation or justification, but an invitation of my own creation. You are invited to Nathan Brooks' Winter Solstice Gathering, January 15th, 7 p.m. at my home, I wrote, centering the words carefully at the top of the page. As I continued writing, I envisioned a small circle of genuine friends, people who had never asked me to dim my light or apologize for my achievements, who saw me for more than just an accessory to someone else's traditions. I pictured an evening of soup and fresh bread from the local bakery, a selection of regional wines, and perhaps a reading from chapter 10 of my book. There would be no gold trim, no formal script, no underlying expectations or social hierarchies to navigate. Just sincerity laid bare on simple white cardstock. As the afternoon light began to wane, I walked to my mailbox and placed my homemade invitations inside, each one carefully addressed to colleagues, mentors, and former students whose eyes had always lit up when we spoke of possibility rather than protocol. I sealed each envelope with a simple sticker bearing my monogram, a modest emblem of ownership over this new chapter of my life. With each seal, I felt a quiet exaltation, like I was reclaiming pieces of territory that had been denied to me for far too long. When I returned home, I sat by my window and watched the snow flurries drift lazily across the sky like tiny dancers in the winter light. Victoria's missed text appeared on my phone screen. "Please, Nathan, can we talk? I want to understand what's happening between us." I left the message unread, choosing instead to hold onto the warmth of my own invitation, one that I had extended not to me, but by me, created entirely on my own terms. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the gentle snowfall and the hush of my own expectations finally being met, I understood something fundamental about belonging. It doesn't begin with acceptance by others. It begins with the courage to build your own table, to create your own gathering, to invite people who genuinely want to be there. That night, as I lit a single candle on my mantle and sipped herbal tea in the peaceful quiet of my apartment, I felt no regret whatsoever. The invitations they had sent had floated to my door like beautiful but untethered paper lanterns, lovely to look at, but ultimately without substance or meaning. I had chosen to watch them drift away, and instead, I had lit my own lantern in the darkness. With that light, steady, unyielding, and undeniably mine, I knew I would never again wait for someone else's permission to belong. Christina's call came on a Tuesday afternoon, one of those late winter days when the sky looks like slate and the air tastes faintly of the coming thaw. I was seated at my writing desk with my elbows propped on the surface, scrolling through notes for chapter 11, when my phone buzzed insistently. Her name flashed across the screen, and I paused before answering, uncertain whether I wanted to hear another apology or endure one more attempt to draw me back under the family's protective but suffocating roof. "Nathan," she began, her voice softer than I remembered it, like the confident tone she had used to exclude me from their New Year's celebration had been replaced by something more tentative and uncertain. She hesitated for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "I'm so sorry for the way we treated you at New Year's. The way I treated you." The words tumbled out of her mouth, clumsy and earnest in a way that was completely unlike the Christina I thought I knew. For a moment, I simply listened to the sound of her own regret, trying to process this unexpected vulnerability. She told me that Victoria had cried for days after the magazine article came out, that her heart had been aching knowing she had stood by silently when I was being pushed out of their family circle. Christina's apologies came in fits and starts, punctuated by admissions of guilt that seemed to surprise even her. "I never realized how much my words could wound someone," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I wish I had defended you instead of joining the chorus of exclusion." But then, just as I was beginning to think this conversation might lead somewhere meaningful, her tone shifted slightly, tempered by the pragmatism I knew all too well from years of family gatherings. "But you should have told us sooner about your success," she said, and I could hear the subtle accusation creeping into her voice. "We could have built you into our narrative properly. We could have been proud of you from the beginning, instead of being caught off guard and having to react to your success after the fact." I felt that familiar flicker of old pain, the realization that even in her apology, I was still being treated as a prop whose value was determined by how useful I could be to their family story. They wanted to celebrate me now, not for who I was as a person, but for what I represented in terms of their social standing. I closed my eyes and pictured the Whitmore holiday tree again, its branches weighed down by ornate ornaments specifically chosen to display their lineage and wealth. In their version of reality, I had always been just another decoration to be swept under the carpet when inconvenient, then retrieved and polished up when it suited their purposes. "I didn't want to be a footnote in your family story," I said quietly, my voice steady and clear. "I wanted to be the author of my own." The words felt both liberating and final, like the last clause in a contract I had definitively refused to sign. I could hear Christina's sharp intake of breath, a sound that was halfway between sorrow and defensiveness. She stumbled through her response, clearly unprepared for my directness. "I understand," she said, though her voice carried uncertainty. "But it's never too late to change things. We want you back in our lives, Nathan. We miss having you around." The invitation in her voice was unmistakable, a plea for me to return, and this time I would be celebrated as the hero of the Whitmore family saga. But I no longer recognized the world they were offering me, a place where my value was defined entirely by their convenience, where approval remained conditional and contingent on my willingness to play whatever role they had written for me. I let a long pause hang between us, feeling the weight of every untold achievement, every discarded invitation, every forced smile I had perfected during years of their gatherings. Then I spoke again, my voice remaining steady and sure. "Christina, what I've built isn't an accessory to your family's image," I said carefully. "It's a refuge I created after you all erased me from your lives." I paused again, giving my words room to breathe and settle. "I appreciate your apology, I really do. But I don't need the Whitmore narrative anymore." She sniffled softly, and I realized she was crying. I didn't know whether to feel triumph or sorrow at the sound of her tears. There was something genuinely heartbreaking about hearing someone finally confront their own cruelty. "Nathan," she whispered, her voice breaking, "please don't close the door forever." I glanced out my window at the pale winter sky, thinking about the solstice gathering I had planned for the following week. I pictured that intimate circle of friends and colleagues who genuinely saw me, unfiltered and unembellished by family politics or social expectations. Those invitations I had created, honest and handmade, were already on their way to doorsteps across the city. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that the door I would be closing on the Whitmores would simultaneously open onto a space entirely of my own making. "I'm grateful for your words, Christina," I said softly. "But this chapter of my life isn't about becoming part of another family's legacy. It's about building my own one, where I don't have to shrink myself to fit someone else's expectations." I pictured the pages of my forthcoming book, each one a testament to perseverance and self-definition. I imagined Victoria's eyes when she would eventually read my foreword, finally understanding that my worth had never been measured by her family's embrace or rejection. Christina's voice cracked as she tried to respond, but I could tell our conversation had reached its natural conclusion. I thanked her for calling and wished her well, then gently ended the call. The silence that followed felt less like an absence and more like a blank canvas waiting for new brushstrokes. I set my phone aside and returned to my notes for Chapter 11, where I was writing about thresholds and boundaries, about the courage it takes to shut out voices that never truly saw you, and to welcome those who celebrate your authentic self. The afternoon light slanted through my window, illuminating the manuscript beneath my hand. In that golden glow, I could sense the finality of Christina's apology and the promise of everything I had yet to write. I didn't post anything on social media that night. No triumphant announcements, no subtle boasts, not even a hint of satisfaction at watching my name ripple through various digital feeds. Instead, I settled into my study under the soft glow of my desk lamp, with scattered drafts of my manuscript spread before me and the unopened mail from Victoria's family gathering dust in a wicker basket by my feet. The house was silent, except for the rhythmic hum of the radiator and the distant whistle of a late train somewhere in the city. In that profound hush, I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace settle over me, one that had nothing to do with accumulation or applause, and everything to do with finally owning my own story. For years, I had equated silence with weakness, seeing it as an absence of defense, a void where my voice should have been. I had believed that to be silent was to surrender, to accept whatever narrative others chose to impose on me without challenge or resistance. But as I leaned back in my chair, tracing the grain of my oak desk with one finger, I realized that silence could be its own form of conviction. It could be a declaration that I didn't need hollow noise to validate my existence. My silence was no longer a sign of submission. It had become my legacy. I stood and moved to my window, where I could see the street lamps flickering against the winter sky like sentinels in the darkness. Each light seemed to acknowledge my new resolve with its steady beam, unwavering despite the cold wind that rattled the glass. I remembered all those nights I had lain awake, haunted by the absence of approval, waking at dawn with a swirl of regret churning in my mind. Those regrets had fueled me in their own way, pushing me toward achievements I hadn't known I could reach. But they had also bound me to other people's expectations, like invisible chains that I was only now learning to shatter. Now, in this stillness, I could see those chains lying broken in the corners of every painful memory. I walked back to my desk and examined the invitation I had created for my own winter solstice gathering. The simple cream cardstock, inked in midnight blue with my own hand, carried neither the weight of tradition nor the promise of pretense. On it, I had written, "You are invited to an evening of warmth and discovery. No masks required." I held it between my fingers, feeling the texture of the paper like a promise of authenticity. My guests would be friends who truly saw me, colleagues who revered my ideas for their merit, and students who admired my perseverance through genuine respect rather than obligation. Not one of them would ask me to dim my light or apologize for my success. As I finished the final lines of Chapter 12 that night, words about authenticity and renewal that felt like they were writing themselves, a soft knock sounded at my study door. Startled, I set down my pen and opened it to find Diana, one of Victoria's friends who had messaged me earlier in the week, standing in my hallway wearing a deep forest green coat. Her breath clouded in the cold air as she extended a simple bouquet of winter flowers, white hellebores and sprigs of juniper that seemed to glow in the porch light. "I wanted to bring these," she said, her voice gentle and sincere, "for everything you've given me through your mentorship over the years." Her gesture felt like sunlight cutting through the dusk of my doubts. I invited her in and placed the flowers in a vase on my desk, right beside my draft pages. We sat together in unhurried conversation, discussing her plans to launch a nonprofit organization and the nuances of starting something meaningful from scratch. She asked no questions about the Whitmores, made no mention of New Year's parties or family apologies. Instead, she spoke of potential and purpose, of creating spaces where everyone could belong based on their own merit rather than their connections or background. In her listening, I felt my true legacy beginning to unfold, not in the echoes of past slights or the satisfaction of proving doubters wrong, but in the building of new bridges that connected people through authentic respect and shared values. After Diana left, I turned off my desk lamp and stood in the dark room for a long moment. The only light came from the faint glow of street lamps outside my window. I thought about all the invitations I had never answered, all the overlooked RSVPs, all the unspoken words that had once defined the boundaries of my existence. All those moments of silence had led me here, to this point where silence was not emptiness, but a canvas on which I would paint the rest of my life. Each unanswered text message, each unread notification, had become a statement of self-determination that I was only now beginning to fully understand. I made my way to the hearth and stirred the log until a small flame blossomed, crackling with new life. The ember light danced across the walls, and I felt a deep kinship with that fire, quiet, steady, unassuming, yet capable of igniting warmth that could wrap around everything it touched. I sat on the hearth's edge and closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of burning wood. In that moment, I felt the impossibility of my journey, but also its absolute necessity. The truth was that my legacy would not be defined by the applause of those who had once turned away from me, but by the silent strength I had cultivated while forging my own path. When I finally rose to leave the room, I looked back at my study door, half expecting another knock, another hopeful face seeking acceptance or offering reconciliation. But the hallway remained dark and empty, the silence complete. I understood then that my greatest testament would be the life I would build in this quiet aftermath. Stone by stone, word by word, guided not by the voices that had excluded me, but by the unwavering echo of my own conviction. One rainy Saturday afternoon, I found myself craving a slice of chocolate cake and the comforting warmth of my favorite boutique cafe. It was the same place where Victoria and her college friends had once gathered for their elaborate holiday teas and weekend catch-up sessions. I wasn't going there seeking them out. In fact, I was hoping for solitude. But when I pushed open the door and felt the familiar bell chime overhead, I realized I had underestimated how quickly word travels in certain social circles. Inside, the cafe smelled of fresh espresso and vanilla bean, its corners lined with plush armchairs and bookshelves stocked with dog-eared novels. I shook off my umbrella and glanced around for an empty table. The place was bustling with weekend energy, but I spotted one seat by the window and slid into it gratefully. I set my satchel beside me, the edge of my winter solstice invitation peeking from the pocket like a small reminder of the new life I was building. I ordered my usual, a slice of chocolate tart and a double espresso, and settled in to review my notes for the keynote speech I would be delivering next month. Outside, the sky darkened as rain drummed steadily against the glass. I lost myself in the rhythm of it, my fingers tracing the margins of my manuscript as I refined the points I wanted to make about consumer psychology and market prediction. Then, suddenly, a hush fell over the cafe. I glanced up and felt dozens of eyes on me, their curious gazes like spotlights in the dim room. The comfortable murmur of conversation had turned into something more pointed, like someone had whispered my name, and the recognition had rippled outward through the crowd. I looked toward the entrance and saw a small group clustered near the door. Victoria's friends from college, dressed in coats too fine for our old neighborhood haunt. Their expressions were a collision of surprise and something that might have been awe. Diana was among them, her eyes wide as she mouthed my name silently. Someone whispered something to her, and the others turned one by one, recognizing me as the consultant who had vanished from their holiday social media feeds only to resurface on the cover of a major business magazine. My heart thudded, but not with the anxiety I might have expected. Instead, a calm clarity settled in my chest. I took a slow sip of my espresso and simply watched as they hesitated, clearly torn between greeting me and slipping past to avoid any awkwardness. At last, Diana broke away from the group and approached my table. The others remained frozen near the counter, like an audience waiting for her signal to determine how this encounter should unfold. She stopped beside my table, her face flushed from the cold and from something deeper, perhaps embarrassment or relief, or a combination of both. "Nathan," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough volume for the nearest tables to catch her greeting. "I didn't expect to see you here." I set down my cup and offered her a small, genuine smile. "I come here for the chocolate cake," I replied simply. She laughed, and the sound still felt like sunlight after months of navigating shadows and uncertainty. "It really is the best in the city, isn't it?" She slid into the seat across from me, glancing back at her friends who continued to hover by the counter like they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. "They can't believe it's really you," she explained, lowering her voice slightly. "They've been following your story, the Business Weekly cover, the book deal, all of it. They thought you'd be appearing on stages in Frankfurt or Chicago by now, not hiding out in our old neighborhood cafe." Her gaze softened with understanding. "But I knew you'd come back to where you found comfort." The rain eased outside for a moment, and a shaft of light broke through the clouds, sending a beam through the window that illuminated the steam rising from our cups. I realized then that my presence here wasn't about hiding at all. It was about authenticity, about returning to the places and people where I felt most myself, not performing or pretending, just existing. Diana reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, her touch warm and reassuring. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. for everything you've accomplished." Her words were simple but profound, the kind of recognition I had longed for my entire life, finally received without strings attached or hidden agendas. The rest of her friends drifted closer, drawn by curiosity and the magnetic calm that seemed to radiate from our table. One by one, they introduced themselves properly, names I had heard in passing at holiday gatherings but had never really known as individuals. They spoke quietly, hesitantly at first, about my upcoming keynote speech, my mentorship work, and the way I had championed their ideas in past conversations. There was no mention of Victoria's family, no awkward apologies for past slights, no attempts to explain away uncomfortable social dynamics, only genuine admiration for the work I had done and the person I had become. I stood to greet each of them properly, shaking hands and offering friendly nods as they gathered around our table. When I returned to my seat, I found that Diana had thoughtfully placed a second slice of chocolate tart and 2 more espressos on the table. Her way of saying that this space was ours to share for as long as we wanted. I raised my fork in thanks and dug into the rich dessert, savoring the way the tartness and sweetness mingled perfectly on my tongue. It felt like a small celebration of authenticity, of being exactly where I belonged. We talked for nearly an hour about business trends, about life changes, about how a single photograph in a magazine can completely rewrite people's perceptions while leaving the essence of who you are entirely unchanged. The conversation flowed naturally, without any of the forced politeness or careful navigation I had grown so accustomed to at family gatherings. Outside, the clouds began to part, and a shaft of afternoon sunlight warmed the sidewalk. Through the window, I could see strangers carrying their umbrellas back into the street, oblivious to the quiet transformation that was taking place inside our little corner of the cafe. As I gathered my satchel to leave, Diana slipped a familiar envelope into my hand. I recognized the cardstock immediately, cream paper with navy lettering, my own invitation to the winter solstice gathering. She winked at me conspiratorially. "I'll be there." I nodded, closing my fingers around the paper with a sense of completion. "I look forward to seeing you." Walking home through the rain-damp streets, the pavement glistening beneath the lamplight, I felt lighter than I had in months. I was buoyed by the knowledge that I was truly seen and celebrated for exactly who I was. No red lipstick ultimatums, no gilded invitations with hidden conditions. Just genuine recognition of an unassuming man who was quietly rewriting his own story, one authentic connection at a time. A week after my encounter at the cafe, my phone chimed with a new email. The subject line was stark and direct. "Simply, I need you." It was from Victoria. I clicked it open with a flicker of hesitation, expecting yet another plea for forgiveness or one more attempt to draw me back into her family's complicated web. Instead, the message that scrolled into view carried a softness I hadn't heard in her voice for months. She began by describing how empty Whitmore House felt without me, how the echo of laughter had been replaced by an uncomfortable quiet that seemed to permeate every room. She confessed that the holly-adorned mantle that had once symbolized their cherished holiday traditions now seemed barren and lifeless, each ornament serving as a reminder of the seat I should have filled. She wrote about waking up in the mornings to the muted glow of string lights, realizing as she sipped her coffee that the gatherings she had once treasured now felt hollow without my presence. Between her carefully chosen lines, I could sense her vulnerability, the long nights she had spent replaying every awkward silence at the party, the guilt that crept over her when she saw my name featured in Business Weekly for the first time, and the deep sorrow that had followed. But then, buried in the midst of these heartfelt words, came a line that both stung and revealed her true motivation. "You've been photographed with major CEOs now. Please tell me this doesn't mean you've moved on from us completely." I stared at that sentence, feeling it settle over me like a final verdict I had been waiting to receive. Of course, she feared that I had outgrown her world, that I had climbed too high and mingled with people far beyond her family's social reach, leaving her behind in the process. But the truth was much simpler than she imagined. I had moved forward, yes, but I had carried her with me in every step, not as an anchor weighing me down, but as someone who had believed in me enough to walk beside me, at least until her family's expectations had forced her to choose sides. I drafted a reply that sat on my screen for hours while I wrestled with how to respond. I thought about telling her that all those lunch meetings with CEOs and conferences in glass towers didn't erase the countless hours we had spent dreaming together on our couch. I considered confessing that every handshake at networking events reminded me of the first time she had squeezed my hand before a big presentation, assuring me with quiet confidence that I could do it. But none of that felt necessary anymore. When I finally wrote back, it was with a single, carefully chosen sentence. Some parties are meant to end before you arrive. I pressed send and felt a curious calm wash over me. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. Victoria's message had been a bid for reassurance, a way to draw me back into a story I no longer inhabited. But by responding as I did, I was closing that door gently yet firmly, acknowledging that our narratives had diverged in ways that couldn't be undone by wistful emails or guilty apologies. Later that evening, I stood at my window watching the city lights flicker on one by one, each one a beacon of possibility in the gathering darkness. I pictured my invitations for the winter solstice gathering scattered on doorsteps across the city, waiting to be opened by people who would genuinely want to be there. In that moment, I understood something profound about endings and beginnings. They often arrive together, intertwined like dancers moving to the same music. The end of one chapter creates the necessary space for the next one to unfold. I turned away from the window and walked back to my desk, where a fresh sheet of paper lay waiting for me. I picked up my pen and began to write Chapter 10, a chapter about renewal, about tables that are built rather than inherited, and about the quiet courage it takes to show up consistently in places where you are always welcome. By mid-January, my home had been transformed into something warm and inviting. I spent the morning of my gathering arranging chairs in a loose circle around my living room, each one draped with a soft blanket in muted, earthy tones. There were no red velvet cushions or gilded accents anywhere, just simple comfort and genuine warmth. The scent of pine drifted through the air from the modest wreath I had hung above the mantel. I had lit candles on every available surface, their gentle glow creating an atmosphere that felt both intimate and welcoming. My homemade invitations, hand-addressed and hand-delivered, lay on the console table by the door, each one stamped and sealed with my navy monogram. I trusted completely that the people arriving tonight would understand that this gathering was about presence rather than pretense, about authentic connection rather than social performance. As my first guest arrived, I was surprised to see Blake from Victoria's family standing at my doorstep. I welcomed him at the threshold, noting how his eyes widened at the warmth of the space. The candlelight danced across the wooden floors, creating an ambience that was worlds away from the formal elegance of Whitmore gatherings. He placed his coat on the rack and accepted a cup of mulled cider without any of the awkwardness I might have expected. We exchanged comfortable small talk about the weather and recent industry conferences. Then, without any fanfare or explanation needed, he simply joined our circle. One by one, familiar faces filled my living room. Diana arrived carrying a tray of freshly baked scones from her favorite bakery. Several of my former mentees came clutching notebooks and eager questions about their business ventures. No one hesitated at my threshold. No one looked around for permission to be there. They belonged here as surely as the flames flickering at the center of our gathering. I offered a brief welcome, my voice steady and sure, as I invited everyone to share something they hoped to build in the year ahead. Business ventures, personal goals, creative projects that mattered to them. The first to speak was a young entrepreneur I had mentored on sustainable design. Her eyes shone as she described securing her first round of funding, her voice carrying the excitement of someone whose dreams were finally taking tangible shape. Each person followed in turn, their voices weaving together a tapestry of ambition, resilience, and genuine hope. When my turn came, I spoke about belonging, how it's not something granted by invitation or family connection, but something created through authentic connection, mutual respect, and the courage to write your own narrative rather than waiting for someone else to include you in theirs. As the evening grew later, laughter echoed off my walls in a way that felt completely different from the forced merriment of holiday obligations. Someone began a spirited debate about the merits of different economic indicators, and soon our circle resembled a round table of genuine friends rather than a formal event with hidden social hierarchies. I noticed the discarded invitations from Victoria's family still tucked into the wastebasket by my piano, their gold-trimmed edges peeking out like relics of an old life I had definitively left behind. I imagined Victoria reading those words I had never written, picturing the moment she might finally realize where she truly belonged in this new version of my story. When my final guest departed into the winter night, I stood at my darkened window watching the lights of the city blink against the winter sky like distant stars. My house, which had once felt so quiet and empty, now felt alive with the echoes of genuine conversation and the lingering memory of authentic warmth. I moved to my piano and ran my finger along its glossy surface, like I was saying goodbye to old ghosts that no longer had any power over me. In the hush that followed, I lit a single candle on the mantel and placed a copy of my forthcoming book beside it. The cover was still in proof stage, but the title shimmered under the flame's glow like a promise finally being kept. I thought about every chapter I had written, every silent moment that had guided me to this place. The table I had built was more than just furniture. It was a testament to self-definition, to the transformative power of inviting yourself to belong rather than waiting for someone else's permission. I walked to the hearth and sat on its edge, closing my eyes as I felt the soft echo of the evening's joy still resonating through the room. Outside, the night deepened around us, but inside, the warmth lingered like a gentle embrace that would carry me forward. In that quiet contentment, I understood fully and completely that I would never again wait for permission to enter any room. I had built my own space, and it would always be open to those who chose authenticity over approval, substance over surface. From the quiet sanctuary of my study, I continued to watch the Whitmore family party unfold through the glow of my laptop screen. The reflection of my face appeared ghost-like on the monitor, a phantom image I scarcely recognized as my former self. Through Victoria's carefully curated social media feed, I could see the lavish display of New Year's lights twinkling like captive stars along the grand veranda of Richard Whitmore's estate. The camera panned slowly over clusters of guests draped in fur-trimmed coats and sequined dresses, their laughter drifting through the digital unreality like distant church bells on New Year's Eve. My own presence was conspicuously absent from every single frame, a deliberate blank space where I should have been standing, perhaps adjusting Victoria's wrap against the cold or steadying her with a whispered compliment about how beautiful she looked. Instead, I was here alone in my study, my heart experiencing a strange combination of aching nostalgia and delighted satisfaction. There was something powerful about knowing they had to look for me in those photographs and not find me anywhere. A new photograph surfaced, showing Victoria looking absolutely resplendent in emerald velvet, leaning gracefully into Christina, whose crystal earrings caught and refracted the roadway lights like tiny prisms. Their father, Richard, stood behind them both in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his eyebrows raised just enough to suggest he believed he had won some unspoken battle between us. In the caption below, Christina had written with obvious pride, "Family, wine, laughter, New Year's perfection. #Whitmore holiday, #love and light." The photo accumulated hundreds of likes within minutes. Friends of friends, college classmates, business associates. The comments tumbled in one after another, praising the glamorous celebration and tagging acquaintances who might have missed their own invitations to this exclusive gathering. Not one of them realized that the most important member of this family celebration had been deliberately and systematically uninvited. For a moment, I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes, allowing myself to imagine what I was missing. I could almost hear the delicate tinkle of champagne glasses as servers in crisp uniforms glided by on silver trays. I could picture the hum of polite conversation swirling around the towering New Year's tree in their foyer, its ornaments forged from generations of heirloom crystal that caught the light and refracted it luxuriously across marble floors that probably cost more than most people's cars. I imagined the reverent hush that would have fallen once the Whitmore family patriarch rose to make his traditional toast. Those carefully chosen words of gratitude and hope for the coming year, punctuated by the gentle clinking of crystal flutes raised in unity. The applause would have been warm and sustained, a gesture of communal pride and shared celebration that bound everyone together in that moment. But I realized with startling clarity that in that moment, the applause would have been for strangers, for a version of me they had never bothered to know, much less appreciate. A second carousel of images appeared on my screen, this time through Instagram stories. There was an intimate close-up of Christina's hand entwined with Victoria's, her manicured nails polished to a glossy sheen that reflected the party lights like tiny mirrors. The next slide showed wine swirling hypnotically in crystal goblets, the deep ruby red seeming to pulse with the merriment of the evening. Then came a boomerang video of Richard raising his glass toward the camera, his booming toast echoing through the speakers as he clicked the side of his flute against the camera lens in a gesture that was both celebratory and slightly performative. The final slide paused on Victoria, turned directly toward the camera with her lips curved into that practiced half-smile she always wore when she felt caught between competing loyalties, between love and family expectations. Beneath her photo, someone had scrolled a comment that made my chest tighten. "Wish Nathan could be here. Missing someone." Her sister Christina quickly replied with a casual shrug emoji, as if my absence was just an unfortunate scheduling conflict rather than a deliberate exclusion. I suppose it felt easier for them to joke about my absence than to admit the profound discomfort they had created by pushing me out in the first place. I didn't scowl or punch my fist into my desk in frustration. Instead, I felt that quiet satisfaction bloom steadily beneath my ribs, the kind that comes from knowing you are seen and acknowledged, even if only through your deliberate absence from their carefully curated family portrait. 5 days had passed since I had watched that final golden envelope slip through my mail slot, the last desperate invitation that I had left deliberately unread on my kitchen counter. 5 days without their orchestrated warmth and those perfunctory smiles I had grown so tired of performing in return. 5 days in which I had leaned completely into my own life, mentoring budding entrepreneurs with genuine enthusiasm, drafting new chapters of my book with renewed purpose, and savoring the private joy of being unseen by people who had never truly wanted to see me in the first place. Then, just as I was about to close my browser and return to my evening's work, I felt my phone buzz insistently with a new alert. It was from Donna, one of Victoria's college friends who had never actually met me in person, but had exchanged polite, surface-level pleasantries with me at every holiday gathering for the past several years. "Wait, is this you on the Business Weekly cover?" Her message read, followed by a screenshot of an online article with the bold headline, "Nathan Brooks, the quiet consultant who became global thought leader." In the photograph that accompanied the article, I was wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit against the backdrop of an urban skyline, my expression calm and self-assured in a way that surprised even me. The piece went on to describe my impending book release in detail, chronicling my unlikely journey from underdog consultant to respected strategist, and highlighting the groundbreaking economic model I would be unveiling at next month's prestigious international symposium. For a heartbeat, I sat completely motionless in my chair, my phone trembling slightly in my hand as the full impact of the moment hit me. Then, slowly, I smiled wide and completely unselfconsciously, like relief and vindication had finally poured through my veins after years of being held back by other people's limitations. Yes, that was definitely me. The man they had refused to acknowledge at their New Year's party, the one they had systematically excluded from their family narrative, was now commanding global attention for his expertise and innovation. The same hands that had typed countless reports in sterile conference rooms, often feeling invisible and undervalued, were now being applauded in digital auditoriums around the world. For a moment, I wanted desperately to forward Donna's message to Victoria, to Christina, to Richard, to every single person who had thought me inconsequential or dismissed my potential. But instead, I took a deep breath and tucked my phone back into my pocket, choosing to close my laptop quietly and spend the rest of my morning at my favorite neighborhood cafe. I walked there through the crisp winter air, sipping strong black coffee while reading the Business Weekly profile about myself on my phone. It felt surreal to see my own words and ideas presented with such respect and attention, to read quotes from interviews I'd given months ago when I was still uncertain whether anyone would care about my perspective. The barista at the cafe wished me good luck with my day, calling out my name with genuine warmth. A stranger at the next table noticed what I was reading and nodded appreciatively, mouthing "congratulations" when he caught my eye. These small gestures of recognition from people who had no agenda, no hidden expectations, felt more meaningful than years of grudging acceptance from Victoria's family. The world was reading me back into existence, one magazine cover at a time, and no amount of red lipstick ultimatums or family political maneuvering could erase the man I had become through my own determination, talent, and relentless hard work. The achievements I had once felt compelled to hide away like shameful secrets were now becoming the cornerstones of my new narrative. I would no longer exist as a mere accessory in someone else's carefully constructed story, tolerated when convenient, but ultimately peripheral to their main attraction. I was finally, definitively, the protagonist of a tale I was writing entirely myself. I no longer needed to ask for permission to attend their parties. Instead, I would host my own gatherings, and they would be filled with people who appreciated authenticity over appearance, substance over status. And so I continued to write, filling page after page with the unwavering conviction that silence could be far more powerful than any argument, that deliberate absence could speak much louder than forced presence. All the things I hadn't said to Victoria's family over the years, the publishing deal that would change my career, the magazine feature that would establish my reputation, the impending book launch that would cement my expertise. All of these achievements found their voice here on these pages. In this narrative I was creating entirely on my own terms. In this story I was telling, they would come to know me not because they had graciously invited me into their exclusive circle, but because I had made the conscious choice to let the world see me for who I truly was, without their permission or approval. By the time my fingers finally stilled on the keyboard, and the final sentence of this chapter awaited its completion, I felt the enormous weight of all those unspoken truths lift from my shoulders like a physical burden I had been carrying for years without even realizing it. I closed my laptop with deliberate care and looked at the framed photograph of my parents on my desk, allowing myself a gentle, genuine smile that came from somewhere deep inside. Tomorrow I would walk into the world with the absolute certainty that I belonged there. Not because anyone had finally given me permission, but because I had claimed my rightful place through my own accomplishments, my own vision, my own relentless pursuit of excellence. And that knowledge, more than any belated invitation or guilty apology, would guide me forward into whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. I spent the remainder of the evening in quiet contemplation, watching the party continue to unfold from the peaceful sanctuary of my study. The glow of my laptop screen cast my reflection back at me like a phantom image I scarcely recognized as my former self. The man who had once waited desperately for external validation. My silence was no longer a sign of submission or defeat. It had become my legacy, my statement of independence, my declaration that I would never again need someone else's approval to know my own worth. I stood and moved deliberately to my window, where I could see the street lamps flickering steadily against the winter sky like sentinels standing guard over my newfound peace. Each light seemed to acknowledge my resolve with its unwavering beam, constant despite the cold wind that rattled the glass. Now, in this profound stillness, I could see those invisible chains that had once bound me to other people's expectations lying broken and powerless in the corners of every painful memory. I walked back to my desk and picked up the invitation I had created for my own winter solstice gathering. Simple cream cardstock, carefully inked in midnight blue with my own hand. It carried neither the weight of centuries-old family tradition nor the promise of elaborate pretense. On it, I had written in my own careful script, "You are invited to an evening of warmth and discovery. No masks required." I held it between my fingers, feeling the honest texture of the paper like a tangible promise of authenticity. My guests would be friends who truly saw me for who I was, colleagues who respected my ideas for their merit rather than their social connections, and students who admired my perseverance through genuine respect rather than obligation or family loyalty. Not one of them would ever ask me to dim my light or apologize for my success. In that quiet contentment that settled over me like a warm blanket, I understood fully and completely that I would never again wait for permission to enter any room, attend any gathering, or claim any space that I had earned through my own efforts. I had built my own table, my own circle, my own community, and it would always be open to those who chose authenticity over approval, substance over surface, genuine connection over social positioning. The world was reading me back into existence, one magazine cover at a time, one article at a time, one speaking engagement at a time. No amount of red lipstick ultimatums or family political maneuvering could erase the man I had become through years of quiet determination and undeniable talent. My greatest testament would be the life I would continue to build in this quiet aftermath, stone by stone, word by word, relationship by relationship, guided not by the voices that had once excluded me, but by the unwavering echo of my own conviction and the respect of people who had always seen my true value. That belonging I had searched for my entire life didn't begin with acceptance by others, as I had always believed. It began with the courage to build your own table, to create your own gathering, to light your own candle in the darkness. And with that light, steady, unyielding, and undeniably mine, I knew I would never again wait for someone else's permission to belong anywhere. I belonged to myself, to my work, to the community I had chosen and built, and that was more than enough.